Guanxiu, living in the mountains, number 2. Difficult to speak of retiring, and then immediately to retire. At the head of a jade-green stream, I sit solitary and clearly in tone. No one comes to the 3-room thatched hut. I wander alone 10 li under the shade of pines. The bright moon, the cool wind at Zongbing's community, the setting sun, the fall colors at Master Yu's pavilion. Cultivating the mind, I have not yet reached the status of no mind. The 10,000 things, the 1,000 sorts, pursue the flowing waters. Okay, so here we have a poem by Guanxiu. Now, Guanxiu, secular name Jiang Zhu de Yin, was a Chan monk. So with this poem, we start taking a look at Buddhist monk poets. Now, this category tends to be overlooked. It was definitely quite overlooked in the 300 Tang poems because of a negative critical appraisal of monkish, religiously inspired type of poetry. That is, as we've been seeing in the 300 Tang poems collection, the standard poet that is imagined producing these poems is a scholar official. So there is this mistrust, of course, of women making poetry, but also of monks or really, really religious Taoistic people or non-Chinese making poetry. The following one is a quote from a book that is about to be published, I believe, by Tom Mazanik about the poetry of Buddhist monks. And he says the following. On the other hand, many of the traditional critics of imperial China who shaped the canon saw Buddhist poetry as immature, clumsy, stinking of the tasteless vegetarian food that monks live on, or worse. The influential critic Wan Fuji, for example, listed the monkish as one of 4 types of bad poetry, and his contemporary, Xu Wei, went so far as to say that in poetry the flavor of meditation is like that of a shed stick. Many others said that monks' poetry had a stench of vegetables and bamboo shoots. Buddhist poetry may be a minor curiosity, or it may be an affront to good taste. So there are many important Buddhist poets that were really valued in the Tang. 2 of them did make it to the 300 Tang Poems Anthology, which are Jiao Ran with 1 poem, and Jia Dao. I think he also has at least 1. Now, Guanxiu, let's make a brief perspective of his life and works, but he lived at the time of the collapse of the Tang. And, well, he was from Zhejiang in the eastern sea coast, orphaned quite young, went to live in a monastery, and very early became well known because of his calligraphic and artistic and poetic promise. After that, he served in a series of regional centers away from his native Wuzhou, for example, in Changzhou, Hangzhou, and in other areas. And yeah, he experienced the chaos of the An Lushan rebellion. Having found patronage and wandered around a couple of the courts that appeared at the end of the Tang dynasty, he actually settled in Shu. So at the time of the fall of the Tang dynasty, probably the best refuge for intellectuals was the state of late Shu, under the court of Wang Jian. And many intellectuals were welcomed there. I think Wei Chuang ended up there. Du Guanting, who was a very important Taoist figure, also, and a friend, I think, of Guanxiu, ended up there. And Guanxiu himself was very well received at that court, where he was heaped with honors and celebrated as both priest and prelate, and given the title of Chanjue Da Shi, Great Master of the Chan Moon. In fact, his surviving collection of poetry is called Chanjue Ji, that is the Diary of the Chan Moon. And so here we have in Guanxiu a very polyphacetic artist. As we said, he was a famous sculptor, I think, painter, poet, and well, I'm not sure sculptor. He has some pictures. So not sculptor, sorry. He has some famous paintings of 16R hats, and well, as a poet. And he was very syncretic in his tastes, in this matching the trends of the late Tang of mixing Buddhism with Taoism and with other elements. In fact, we're not going to include it in this, but he has a poem called Dashing Sangjiao, greatly exalted other three doctrines, which praises Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And we will see some of his poems later on that have a strongly Taoist flavor. But today's poem is the poem we've just read. It's a very good example of Buddhist poetry. So, living in the mountains, living in retirement. The poem we've read is the second of a series of 24 called Shanju, living in the mountains, which he wrote while he was living in Zhongling near modern Nanchang in Jiangxi, probably in about 863, 864. And the predilection for Buddhism is quite clear in this poem. What's the topic? Well, the retired life, which is also quite a common topic in scholar official poets. But here it's clearly seen from the perspective of the monk who has gone away from the world and who is living in the mountains. The poem includes a depiction of that sort of lonely, solitary life. It has landscape elements as well in describing the nature in which the poet is living. It has historical references also, which we will comment in the, I think it was the third couplet probably, references to Zongbing and Master Yu, which connect us to the Western and the Eastern Jin dynasties, more than 500 years before Guanxiu's own time. And it has this Buddhist message of trying to reach illumination, whether successfully or unsuccessfully, that is open to discussion, as the last couplet, in the last line of the last couplet, is a bit ambiguous. Let's take a look then at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. Difficult to speak of retiring, and then immediately to retire. At the head of a jade green stream, I sit solitary and clearly in tone. So the title is Living in the Mountains. The area of Chongling was pretty close to Mount Lu, which would have been a great religious Buddhist center. Lushan had been an important Buddhist center since the times of Hui Yuan, who is referenced indirectly in the poem. So this is the area, the southern China, mid-central southern China, Lushan, or close to Lushan, where a lot of Buddhist institutions are. So the first couplet is usually the introductory one. The first line tells us how difficult it is to follow up, to walk the walk after talking the talk about living the retired life. But, Guanxiu, or at least his poetic persona, has followed up. And the second line makes it clear. The poet is in the mountains. He is here solitary, intoning, presumably Buddhist sutras, and close to a beautiful stream in the mountains. So the poet is indeed living in the mountains. That's what the first couplet depicts for us. The poet chanting next to a river deep in the mountains. Second couplet. No one comes to the 3-room thatched hut. I wander alone 10 li under the shade of pines. So the second couplet puts the focus on the loneliness of the poet. Like he's not living probably in a Buddhist community. He is a hermit. So he is somewhere deep in the mountains, living alone in a small hut. And the main characteristic of this life is its detachment from the world and therefore its loneliness. The poet is alone. No one comes to his hut. He walks around 10 li, which is a relatively considerable distance, under the shade of the pines, and he encounters nobody. So he is at one with nature. Third couplet. The bright moon, the cool wind at Zongbing's community, the setting sun, the fall colors at Master Yu's pavilion. So this is, even in the translation, it's very easy to see that this is a very strictly and well-made parallelistic couplet. So bright moon, setting sun, cool wind, fall colors, Zongbing, Master Yu, community pavilion. The parallelism has been kept in the translation pretty effectively. So we've got sights of nature, the moon, the wind, the setting sun, the fall colors, and these sights of nature which the poetic persona is experiencing in his mountain life bring to his mind similar scenes from the past. So the bright moon and the cool wind at Zongbing's community. Now, Zongbing was an aesthete, I think a painter, from the late 4th century, early 5th century, Anno Domini, and he was part of a community of Buddhists, the Lotus Society, who lived on Mount Lu during the Taijuan era. And this community had been set up by Huijuan, also late 4th century, early 5th century, Western Jin dynasty and its fall. And he's a very important figure in Chinese Buddhist history as the founder of the Buddhist community at Lushan. And he also even makes it into popular literature. I've recently read one of the ballads and stories found at Dunhuan that Arthur Whaley translated into English, and one of the stories is precisely about Huijuan and the legends associated with him. So this line, Zongbing's community, evokes a Buddhist community of people who vow to be reborn in Amitabha's Western Pure Land. Maybe the poet is expressing his wish to join this Buddhist community, so not just be a lone hermit in the mountains, but maybe be part of a wider supporting Buddhist group. So he is evoking the sights of nature at Zongbing's community, which would have been very close to where he himself was actually dwelling. And then the setting sunfall colors at Master Ju's pavilion. Now, Master Ju is Ju Liang. He is an Eastern Jin? I'm not completely sure. I thought he was an Eastern Jin figure. But anyway, the notes I have here mention that he was an important political figure, and that he governed the region near Mount Lu and had a pavilion built there. The juxtaposition of these two figures of Zongbing and Master Yu is a curious one, and so it represents different tensions probably at work within Guanxiu, because Master Yu would probably represent, political interests, this worldliness, even if he built a pavilion relatively close to where Guanxiu was dwelling, whereas Zongbing and the Pure Land community would represent the purely Buddhist and ascetic sort of lifestyle and complete detachment from the world. And there is a tension here. Remember, Guanxiu was a Chan Buddhist, but he was also a this-worldly person who mostly spent a lot of time in the courts of different princes, composing flattering pieces for them, and being honored and respected by those figures. So there is this tension in the great Buddhist monk between this life of retirement, which he is partially leading here, but which he will discontinue in the future, we know from Guanxiu's biography. And so there is the tension between these two, this worldliness of the courtier, poet, and monk at the same time. So there is this tension. And the last line continues with this tension. So the poet says, last couplet, cultivating the mind, I have not yet reached the status of no mind. The 10,000 things, the 1,000 sorts, pursue the flowing waters. So the poet, a Buddhist, would wish to attain no mind, wu xin, a state in which one manages to extinguish troubling thoughts and desires. A very typical Buddhist objective. But he tells us that he hasn't yet reached that status. And that final line, the 10,000 things, the 1,000 sorts, pursue the flowing waters, seems to imply or to suggest his lack of success as time passes, or more likely that he is able to release his ties to the worldly. Which is it? Is he like the 10,000 things, the 1,000 sorts, pursuing the flowing waters, or has he actually managed to stem the flood, to stop going after flowers and to center himself in Buddhist illumination? So, yeah, an interesting Buddhist poem, and I think it's very representative of this type of poetry and its characteristics.